This particular publication that I'm holding up now is quite fascinating. Somewhere between a newspaper and a magazine, it was called The Political State of Great Britain, and this is the issue for April of 1719. And the best way to really show why I love so many of these things is to actually quote from it. So, there's a little headline in here that says, "Account of the killing of the famous pirate Thatch or Blackbeard." And it says, "There being advice that one Thatch, alias Blackbeard, had since his pretended acceptance of his Majesty's gracious pardon, committed several piracies, and some in the adjacent colony of North Carolina, where the ships of war would not come to attack him with his crew, Captain Gordon and Captain Brand consulted with Colonel Spotswood, Governor of Virginia, and manned out 2 sloops from the ships under their command, which were sent in quest of the aforesaid pirates, one of them under Lieutenant Maynard of the Pearl, and the other under a midshipman belonging to the line. On the 22nd of November, they had a fight of the pirate sloops on the coast of North Carolina, and rowed up to them, when Thatch himself hailed them, and asked from whence they came, and who they were. To which he was answered, that he might see to whom they belonged, by their colors. Thereupon he drank damnation to them, and said that he would neither take nor give quarter. To which they answered, that they did not expect, nor would they give any. Upon which he fired upon them with 4 3-pounders and 4 swivel guns, loaded with small shot, which he brought to bear on them on one side, the sloops, which were fitted out against them, having no other than small arms. The fire continued between them for the space of an hour, in which time he killed or wounded great part of the sloop's companies. But at length they clapped him on board with both sloops, and behaving themselves gallantly, killed Thatch himself and 9 of his men, and took 9 other prisoners, who were most of them wounded. After the action was over, Lieutenant Maynard ordered Thatch's head to be cut off, which he hung under the bowsprit of his ship, and carried it in that manner to Virginia, where those pirates who had been... Now we're looking at an early Philadelphia magazine published in 1786 called the Columbian Magazine, and what is significant about this issue is that it contains a copperplate engraving in the interior of the first mechanized form of transportation in the colonies, or actually in the Young Republic. It's a picture of Fitch's steamboat. So I'm very interested in not just military and political events, but also in the history of inventions. And, you know, later on we have the development of the railroad, which is chronicled in the archive, and the earliest automobiles, and the earliest planes. Actually, I should say, before planes, we have balloons in the 18th century, and then later on in the 20th century, we've got Wright brothers and developments from there into space. So I'm very interested in not just political and military events, but everything that's important to the history of this country and the world as revealed through these important original newspapers. This is the only copy of an original item that I have in the archive where I didn't bring the original to this interview because of frankly, of the rarity and the value of it. But this is a Providence newspaper where the entirety of the front page is taken up in 1787 with a printing of the newly formed Constitution, and the famous preamble, "We the People," begins the article in the first column. I mentioned earlier that the first English language newspaper was the Oxford Gazette that became the London Gazette. Bound into this is an extra broadside being an item printed on only one side, much like a modern day poster. And when we open it up, there's a letter from the American Antiquarian Society authenticating the piece for the collector who originally owned it. And we see a broadside extra that details the Battle of Bunker Hill in 1775. And this particular extra broadside is perhaps the only known copy still in existence. In some cases, I keep newspapers in the archive simply because of the rarity of the title. And that is the case with this newspaper, published in New Hampshire in 1789, the year George Washington was elected to be our first president. It's the only example of this title that I've ever owned in all the years. Here we have an 1844 campaign newspaper with Jugut portraits of James Polk and his running mate for Vice President, George Dallas. And the archive is replete with many examples of campaign newspapers, which really began during the administration of Andrew Jackson and continued right on through the present, where newspapers supported specific candidates for not just president, but for governor and other offices. And now we have an extra issue of the famous title, The New York Sun, and this particular issue is dated 1850, and we see a very large woodcut engraving of the steamship, which had just arrived from the West Coast, with news of the gold rush, which had begun in 1848. And in this case, we see headlines saying that $1 million worth of gold had been brought back on this particular journey. Here we have a very rare combination of factors that make this an important item for the archive. The title is rare, the weekly varieties. It's, again, the only issue I've ever seen in private hands. The fact that it was published in the Wild West in San Francisco in 1859 is important. And finally, there is a comic on the front page, as well as 2 comics on the back page. And I am very interested in the evolution of comics, comic strips in newspapers and news publications. In fact, I am an author of a chapter in the Overstreet Comic Guide, which is sort of the Bible for comic book collectors. Each year my article comes out about an age that I coined the phrase for, called the Pioneer Age of Comics. People are very familiar with the terms Golden Age comics, Silver Age comics. I introduced the comic world to the early predecessors of the modern day comic book in the form of 16th century European comics, and then going into 18th century American comics, and later the birth of Sunday comic, color comics in the 1890s, and so on and so on.